The rain had been falling since morning, but Sergeant David Henderson didn't move an inch from his post. He stood tall at the tomb of the unknown soldier, his uniform crisp, his rifle gleaming even under the gray clouds. Every step he took was measured. 21 steps forward, a pause, then 21 steps back. For years he had guarded the tomb with pride, but today the air felt different. The wind carried a strange chill, and dark clouds rolled in faster than usual. David knew a storm was coming. The sky had that heavy feeling before chaos began, yet in his heart he wasn't worried about himself. His thoughts were with the soldiers who rested beneath the white marble, the ones whose names were lost to history but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. Guarding them wasn't a job. It was a promise, a sacred oath. By afternoon, warnings started spreading. Weather stations predicted one of the worst superstorms in years. Winds up to 90 miles per hour, heavy rain, flooding. People were urged to stay indoors and prepare for power outages. At Arlington National Cemetery, some of the staff started securing buildings and locking gates. A few officers came to the tomb guard quarters and said that because of the danger, the guard watch could be suspended for safety. But David and his fellow guards refused. The tomb of the unknown soldier had been guarded through every challenge: rain, snow, hurricanes, and even war. Never once had the watch been stopped. To them, breaking that record wasn't an option. "If they stood for us," David said quietly, "we can stand for them." As the hours passed, the wind began to howl. The air turned sharp, and the first flashes of lightning lit up the cemetery. David adjusted his cap, checked his rifle, and stepped onto the black mat. His shoes clicked against the ground, perfectly timed. The echo carried across the marble, mixing with the sound of rain. Even as thunder rolled, his movements stayed calm, precise and respectful. Every motion represented years of discipline and honor. Tourists and visitors had already been told to leave. The grounds were empty now, except for the guards and a few security officers. One of the supervisors approached him again, shouting over the wind, "Henderson, it's getting worse. You need to get inside." But David didn't respond. He simply turned at the end of his 21 steps and began again, his expression steady. The storm didn't matter. His duty did. The rain became heavier, blinding at times. It hit his face like needles. His gloves were soaked and water streamed down his uniform. His boots squished with every step, but still he marched. Lightning flashed so bright it lit the entire tomb for a second, revealing his silhouette. Straight-backed, rifle on shoulder, eyes forward. In that moment, he looked less like a man and more like a symbol. A figure of devotion standing against the full power of nature. Inside the small guardhouse, his relief team watched anxiously. They knew they were next to go out, but none of them hesitated. They were proud, not afraid. Each guard had taken the same oath, trained for years, and understood what it meant to serve something bigger than themselves. They prepared their uniforms even as water leaked through the windows and wind rattled the doors. By nightfall, the storm hit its full strength. Trees bent under the wind. Rain pounded so hard it sounded like stones on the marble. The American flag above the cemetery whipped violently, yet still flew strong. David's heart pounded, but not from fear. It was pride. Pride in his brothers who served beside him, in the soldiers who rested under the ground, and in the generations of guards who had never given up their post. Every few minutes, he could feel the ground tremble from thunder. The lights flickered, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the cemetery. Only the lightning showed flashes of white tombstones stretching endlessly into the distance. But even in that darkness, David kept moving. Step by step, turn by turn. He was soaked to the bone, exhausted, but his focus never broke. At one point, he felt something shift, a mix of fatigue and the full weight of the storm pressing against him. His vision blurred slightly from the rain. He tightened his grip on the rifle and took a deep breath. In his mind, he repeated the words every tomb guard learns. "My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, I will never falter." Those words kept him standing when his legs wanted to give up. They gave him strength when the cold tried to break through his spirit. The world outside Arlington could collapse under the storm's fury. But here, before the tomb, there would be no weakness, no retreat. An officer came again around midnight, wearing a raincoat and shouting to be heard. "Sergeant Henderson, the storm's turning dangerous. We're moving everyone to safety." David finally looked at him, his face half hidden in the shadows. His voice was calm, steady. "Sir, my orders are here. The watch doesn't end. The officer paused, then nodded quietly. He understood. Some duties were greater than fear. As the wind roared, David's relief arrived, another guard, just as soaked and determined. They exchanged no words, only a nod. It was a moment of respect between two soldiers who knew the value of silence. The new guard took position and David stepped aside briefly, wiping rain from his eyes. His body ached, but his spirit felt light. He looked back at the tomb once more before walking to the guardhouse. The white marble seemed to glow faintly in the lightning, pure and unshaken. He knew this night would be remembered, not for the storm, but for the strength it revealed. No matter how fierce nature became, some things remained unbroken: duty, honor, and the sacred promise made to those who could no longer speak for themselves. As the wind continued to howl outside, David took off his drenched gloves and placed his rifle on the rack. His shift was over, but the watch would go on. It always did. And deep down, he knew that as long as there were men and women who understood the weight of that oath, the tomb of the unknown soldier would never be left alone, not even in the heart of a superstorm. The night was darker than usual. Clouds moved fast across the sky, and the sound of thunder echoed over the hills of Arlington Cemetery. Sergeant David Henderson stood inside the small guardhouse, preparing for his next shift. His uniform was still damp from the earlier storm, but there was no time to rest. The wind howled like a living thing outside, bending trees and shaking the windows. The storm had grown stronger, but so had his resolve. As he stepped out again, rain poured down in thick sheets. Lightning flashed behind the trees, and the sky rumbled like a warning. The path before the tomb of the unknown soldier glistened with water, reflecting the marble like a mirror. David adjusted his cap, lifted his rifle to his shoulder, and began his precise walk. 21 steps forward. Pause. 21 steps back. The rhythm was everything. It kept him focused when everything else tried to pull him apart. Each step echoed through the night, blending with the rain. There was no audience now, no visitors to see his devotion. Only silence, thunder, and the eternal resting place of those who gave everything for their country. But that was enough. His duty wasn't about being seen. It was about keeping a promise made long before he was born. A promise that no soldier, known or unknown, would ever be forgotten. Inside the guardhouse, the relief commander kept checking the weather reports. The storm was worse than anyone had predicted. Roads were flooded, trees were falling, and even the power grid across parts of Washington, D.C. had gone dark. He radioed the guards, asking if they needed to suspend the watch for safety. The answer was the same each time. The watch continues. Hours passed. The temperature dropped and the rain turned icy. David's hands were numb, his face pale from the cold wind, but he never broke his rhythm. His mind drifted to the stories of those who had guarded this place before him. He remembered reading about guards who stood through hurricanes, snowstorms, and blistering heat. They all had one thing in common: they never left their post. Each thunderclap seemed to test him. Each gust of wind tried to push him off balance. But with every challenge, he only straightened his back and marched stronger. He wasn't just guarding stone. He was guarding history, honor, and sacrifice. The unknown soldiers buried beneath that marble had no names, no families to visit them. But they had him. A few hours into the night, his relief came. The new guard, a younger soldier named Carter, looked nervous. His boots splashed into puddles as he approached. "Sergeant," he said, almost shouting through the wind, "they're saying we can stop the watch. The storm's out of control." David turned to him, water streaming down his face. His voice was calm but firm. "If the unknown soldiers didn't quit when things got hard, neither will we." "Take your position, soldier." Carter nodded, his fear replaced by determination. Together they marched, taking turns on the line, their movements synchronized like clockwork. The storm roared louder. The lightning cracked across the sky, so close it made the air tremble. The wind tore at their clothes, but their steps remained steady. Even the cameras around the cemetery, meant to record the watch, were blurred by the rain. Yet the shapes of the guards could still be seen, moving back and forth, small figures of honor standing against nature's fury. Sometime after midnight, a tree crashed nearby, scattering branches across part of the walkway. The guards paused only for a second, then cleared the path together. The marble surface was slick and dangerous, but they continued as if nothing had happened. Every second was a reminder that their oath meant more than comfort or safety. Inside, the relief commander watched the two guards through the fogged glass window. He felt a deep respect for them. He wanted to order them in for their own safety, but he also understood something powerful. These men weren't just following orders. They were protecting a promise that went beyond rank or command. So instead of stopping them, he stood silently and saluted. By 3 a.m., exhaustion began to set in. David could feel his legs ache, his shoulders heavy under the soaked uniform. The rain was relentless and the wind seemed determined to break him. But as he looked at the tomb, shining faintly under the dim security lights, he felt a surge of energy. He thought of his grandfather, a veteran who used to tell him stories of courage and sacrifice. He thought of the thousands of families who had never been able to bring their loved ones home. That thought alone gave him strength to take one more step. The cemetery was silent except for the storm. Even the animals had hidden away, but the guards remained. They were the heartbeat of that sacred ground, the only movement in the darkness. Every step they took was a tribute to lives once lived, to bravery that never faded. As the hours crept toward dawn, the storm began to change. The thunder grew softer and the wind slowly calmed. The worst had passed, but the damage was clear. Branches everywhere, flooded paths, and debris scattered across the lawns. Still, the tomb stood unharmed. The marble shone faintly, untouched by the chaos that had surrounded it all night. David stood silently for a moment, watching the horizon lighten just a bit. The storm was ending. He looked down at his soaked gloves and smiled faintly. They had made it through the longest night, not because they were stronger than the storm, but because their hearts refused to yield. As the new relief arrived to take over the morning shift, David finally stepped back. The young guard saluted him sharply. "You kept the watch, sir," the soldier said with admiration. David simply nodded and replied, "The watch never ends." He turned toward the guardhouse, his boots heavy but his spirit light. Behind him, the next guard began the same steps, 21 forward, 21 back. The pattern never changed, not even in the face of a superstorm. That night, the tomb of the unknown soldier had once again proven something eternal. Storms can break trees and shake the earth, but they can't break honor. And as long as men like David Henderson stood their ground, that sacred promise would never fade with the wind. When morning finally came, the storm had left behind a strange quiet. The sky was still gray and the air smelled of wet earth and broken branches. The trees around Arlington National Cemetery leaned tiredly. Some snapped in half, others stripped of leaves. Water pooled on the marble walkways and the grass glistened with dew. But through all the damage, one thing remained exactly as it was: the tomb of the unknown soldier. White, strong, and unshaken. Sergeant David Henderson stood near the tomb, his uniform still damp, his body aching from hours of cold and fatigue. He looked at the marble surface that he and his team had guarded through the night. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just breathed in the silence. The storm had howled for hours, but it had not touched this sacred ground. He felt a deep calm inside him, a feeling that words could never fully describe. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, David saw the next team of guards arriving for duty. Their faces showed both admiration and concern. They had heard what happened overnight, how the watch continued even when the storm reached its worst. One young guard saluted David, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You kept it going, sir. You didn't stop." David shook his head slowly. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about them." He looked back at the tomb. The names of the unknown were carved into the stone, but in truth it wasn't about names at all. It was about sacrifice. It was about every soldier who never made it home, and whose family never got the chance to say goodbye. Soon, senior officers and cemetery staff arrived to inspect the damage. They were shocked by what they saw: fallen trees, broken fences, and debris everywhere. But when they reached the tomb, they stopped in silence. It was untouched. The guard walkway was clean, the flag still flying. And when they saw Henderson and his fellow guards standing tall beside it, they realized something powerful. News of the storm had already spread across the area, and within hours, word reached the media. Photos of the guards, drenched but standing firm, began circulating online. People across the country were moved. Many couldn't believe that during one of the worst storms in years, the tomb had still been guarded without a break. Messages of respect and gratitude flooded in. When reporters asked the army for a statement, they explained that the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier had never been interrupted since 1937, through wars, snowstorms, and hurricanes. The storm last night had tested that record once again, and it held strong. People began calling it the watch that never ends. David, however, didn't think of it as history. To him it was simple, duty done the way it should be. He and his team didn't ask for recognition. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just soldiers fulfilling their promise. When a reporter approached him a few days later asking, "Why didn't you stop the watch during the storm?" David smiled gently and said, "Because they never stopped for us." That single line touched millions of hearts. The following week, a small ceremony was held to honor the tomb guards who stood through the storm. Officers and fellow soldiers gathered in quiet respect. The commanding officer spoke briefly about courage and dedication. When David's name was mentioned, he simply stood at attention, his expression humble. He wasn't comfortable being praised. He knew that countless guards before him had done the same thing and would continue to do it long after he was gone. That evening, when the crowd was gone and the cemetery returned to silence, David walked alone along the rows of white headstones. The air was cool, and the last bit of sunlight painted the sky gold. He thought of his time there, of the many nights he had marched in silence while the city slept. Every shift had taught him something, about patience, discipline, and honor. But that stormy night had taught him the deepest lesson of all. True respect is not shown when it's easy. It's proven when it's hard. He stopped at the edge of the tomb once more and watched the guard on duty. The young soldier's steps were perfect. 21 forward, pause, 21 back. The same rhythm, steady and proud. The same promise continuing without end. David felt a small sense of peace knowing that the watch would always go on, no matter what storms might come. Over the next few days, visitors returned to Arlington. Families brought flowers. Children stood silently beside their parents, and veterans saluted with tears in their eyes. Some of them had heard about the guards who faced the storm. They came to see the tomb, but they also came to see the spirit behind it, the spirit of men and women who honored the fallen with their strength and silence. David would sometimes overhear visitors whispering, "Can you believe they stayed out there all night?" He never corrected them or tried to take credit. He just smiled quietly because in his heart he knew that the story wasn't about him or any one person. It was about all who had ever stood that post, past and present. It was about the bond between the living and the lost. Weeks passed and the city slowly repaired the damage caused by the Superstorm. But among the soldiers, the night of the storm became something of a legend. New guards heard about it during training. It reminded them that being a tomb guard wasn't just a job, it was a lifelong promise. One night, long after his shift had ended, David returned to the tomb again. He stood at a distance, the air calm and stars shining above. The cemetery was peaceful, every stone gleaming under the moonlight. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought about the unknown soldiers resting beneath his feet. "I kept my word," he whispered softly, "and I know others will keep it too." Then, after a quiet salute, he turned and walked away. Behind him, the guard continued his steady march, rifle at shoulder, steps echoing softly in the night. The watch remained unbroken, just as it had through the storm. In the end, David's story wasn't one of fame or glory. It was a reminder of something simple yet powerful, that real honor doesn't need an audience and true courage doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand firm, even when the world shakes. The tomb of the unknown soldier still stands untouched by time, weather, or war. And every minute of every day a guard keeps watch through sunshine and through storms, because of the same sacred promise.